Sri Lanka has plunged into deep economic crisis and yet a political crisis that needs to be resolved immediately towards stability. I've invited to our studios a gentleman who will best describe Europe's political system, a system that Sri Lanka can draw insights from, a system where Sri Lanka can move towards and maybe look for democratic solutions. Today we will be talking to former Human Rights Commissioner and former Member of Parliament, former member of the German federal government, Mr. Markus Löning. A very warm welcome, Ayubowan, to Sri Lanka. I think you've been in Sri Lanka for the past few days. You arrived on Sunday, the day after protesters stormed key locations in Colombo. Of course, this crisis has been ongoing for some time, but July the 9th of 2002 will go down in history as a day that the largest crowd came into Colombo. And the day after, you decide to fly into our beautiful island nation.
I did, and I must say it was a very special situation, very obviously. I came in early in the morning. We were driving past the presidential palace, and there was a few people still there, but everything was quiet. It was on a Sunday morning. And I found it quite interesting also to walk the streets and between the residence of the Prime Minister and the presidential palace, and to see the people move around. They had their kids with them, some of them, and there was a sense of peacefulness. And there was a sense that I very much liked of hope also, that something would change for the better.
And no signs of a previous chaotic situation the day before. Sunday was calmer. And today we're talking about a period where curfews have been implemented in Sri Lanka from the Western province, then improved until an island-wide curfew to curtail the situation and contain tensions within the country. A state of emergency implemented and enforced in the country by an acting president. The president of the country, whose resignation was expected on the 13th of July, is in Maldives, and the news currently is that we are awaiting for him to go to Singapore to have his resignation letter sent to the Speaker of Parliament, according to the Speaker himself. But how do you, as an outsider, view Sri Lanka's situation here, especially because you have visited Sri Lanka 20 years ago?
Well, obviously, 20 years ago, this was a very different place, and a lot has happened, and a lot has happened in the right direction. You see a lot of development taking place in those 20 years, without any question. The situation from an outsider is like my family was asking me, oh, why are you going there? Isn't it dangerous? And what's happening? And on the other side, I felt I wasn't exposed to anything which felt dangerous in any way to myself. On the contrary, I was, people were very friendly. They were talking to me, they were asking questions, and they were sharing their views and their feelings with me, which I very much appreciated. And I think the most important thing in such a situation is to have a transition which is clear. Where are we heading? So I think that's something, a responsibility for the leaders, those leaders that are there, that are still in office or planning to leave office. Whoever has been elected into office has a responsibility to also show a clear path forward.
When you say transition, I'm not sure if you had the time to really understand the Sri Lankan situation, the constitutionality and the context, but I'm sure you can shed some light over the situation here given your experience in Germany. Currently, acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is Prime Minister, constitutionally, President can appoint him as acting President, which has happened. So he has taken over duties as the acting head of state, and now the party leaders are meeting, and there are discussions on how Parliament will resolve this crisis. But when you say transition, in what direction and how do you think Europe or Germany would take a situation as this?
I think the first thing is respect people's safety. I think that's number one. People should be safe and feel safe. And the second thing is respect constitutional and the law, the rule of law, respect democratically elected members of parliament, elected leaders. But then on the other side, that also puts the responsibility on the shoulders of those that have been elected into parliament, party leaders, whoever they are, to show the way forward and to work together to the best and to the protection of everyone on the island. I think that's creating a clear and stable perspective is really the key now for all citizens, obviously, but also for the outside world watching your country and saying, you know, where are they heading? Do we see a perspective there?
Mm-hmm. Again, in this given current juncture, Sri Lanka is also dealing with protesters who've turned violent, protesters who have forcibly taken over key locations of the country, the presidential secretariat, the president's house, the temple trees, the prime minister's official residence, and last night even stormed the president's office down Flower Road in Colombo. Now, this is a situation I doubt even Europe would allow in the name of dissent and allowing protesters to voice their opinion. The struggle itself has been peaceful for more than weeks, months, and yet the situation now needs to be immediately addressed where order, the peace and rule of law should be maintained. So how would such a situation, do you think, your part of the world would address?
First of all, I think it's important that leaders sit at the table and work together and don't go into old divisions or so. Leaders need to sit together and say, okay, we have a responsibility for this country, for its people, to come back to a very peaceful situation. I think violence is never bringing any situation forward. Violence is always something that should be stopped. That's a responsibility on everyone's side. On those that are in government or that have roles to play in parliament, in the security forces, but also with those that are protesting. Violence is always leading astray and is leading to situations that shouldn't take place. Mm-hmm. We also have violent protests in Europe. It's not that it doesn't happen, but we try to find ways of bringing violence down, of bringing tensions down in a way so that people can start talking again, discussing, seeing what's the future of our country, where do we need to go, how do we actually improve people's day-to-day life, how do we resolve the fuel crisis and other situations that we have. I think that's what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. How concerned are you about the trend in Sri Lanka given the deteriorating economic situation? Sri Lanka has been talking about this since last year, that we will be in crisis situation, and the leaders were asked to go and work with the International Monetary Fund, which is happening now under the leadership of the current Prime Minister and acting President. But then again, how concerned are you about a similar trend? Because this economic crisis, although Sri Lanka faced it at the end of last year, is a situation that even the US is hit. Inflation skyrocketed, yesterday we heard of this, to a 40-year high. In the UK too, prices are soaring, and in other parts of Europe. And in South Asia, how concerned are you?
Well, there's a general concern about the economic situation in the world. We have a very dire situation, not the right word, but we have a strained situation in Germany as well, where we see inflation going up, food getting more expensive by the day, so people are very concerned. Energy prices are rising all the time, so there is concern there. And I have a concern that this should not grow into a global crisis, a global economic crisis. So it is important that all the actors, the state actors, work together and say, okay, where are we? What can we do? What are the levers that we have to make sure this is not turning into a global recession? We need to consolidate this, and I think there will be hardships for all involved. There will be hardships for German consumers, and there will also be hardships in your country given the situation. But especially for your country, I see the general prospect actually very optimistic. You are a fairly small nation in your surroundings, so you have the flexibility to improve situation, to improve legislation, to work on it. You have a long democratic tradition of discourse, of talking to each other. So you have stability. You have a couple of very great companies out there that are working on a global scale. You are a fantastic tourism destination. People love coming here. So you have a lot in your hands actually, but it needs to be turned into a situation where it pays people's salaries, where it creates income, where you can go back to exporting your goods again. So there's work to do without any question. And I think it's important for all political leaders in all countries to say, okay, this is not going to be an easy time, the coming months, but on the whole, the perspectives over the coming years are actually there, and they're good.
You have a sense of optimism for Sri Lanka
Absolutely.
in relation to other nations. So let's talk about that. That's a good way forward for a small island nation. You've spoken about the rich democratic traditions that Sri Lanka has been enriched with, the values that Sri Lanka has treasured over years. But again, about companies, I'd like to just touch through your profile a little. You're now, in 2014, you founded your firm that consults for human rights compliance for big companies dealing with, maybe especially in the export market. Earlier you said that Sri Lanka has big companies that could bring value to the country. We sustain now because of these private sector companies amidst a shortage in dollars that the country is faced with. So how do you advise that Sri Lanka and these companies continue to sustain these good practices amid a crisis in the country, especially when we're dealing with Europe as our buyers?
Well, there's two things. You have some big companies in the apparel sector, for example, that are pacemakers in that. They've grown enormously in the past decades, and they've shown, this is a good place to develop a business and to even develop a global business, a business that can meet standards that important brands across the world have. And they have these standards nowadays. They say, well, we're selling products to consumers, and we want to be sure that those that are making these products, that are actually producing them, participate in the value creation, that they're treated with respect, that their workplace is safe, and that their health is protected. So that's a new trend, if you want to call it that way, so that responsible consumers say, this is what we want. We don't want to have cheap products at the detriment of those that produce those products. And so there you have a standard in your country, you have pacemakers in your country, and others can learn from those around. And obviously government needs to support these trends and help. Enter also a dialogue and say, okay, what can we do as government to protect people in the workplace as well?
Since you arrived on the 10th of July, a day after the 9th July 2002, you've met with companies, heads of companies, chambers of commerce, and spoken about export opportunities for Sri Lankan companies. Before we go to export opportunities, I'd like to talk a little about how Sri Lanka, the image of this beautiful island nation, how we are perceived across Europe and especially in Germany, given the current crisis situation. How do we use this crisis now to transform it into a land of opportunities that you spoke of in the short term, in the immediate term?
First of all, I think you need to put yourself back on the map in a positive sense. And business should be part of that because they add something. And secondly, I think putting yourself in a positive sense back on the map of people is also overcoming the current political crisis and the economic crisis that you have. So it's very important to have a government in place that will show stability and that will work on the real problem and not promise things they cannot pay for. But also tell people, this is not going to be an easy Sunday walk. We're all going to work hard. But that gives us the chance to overcome that and to move into new directions. So it needs stability, political stability. It needs political leaders that take things in their hand, but it also takes business leaders or other community leaders that support that and say, okay, let's move forward together. And let's maybe also overcome political debate here and there when it's actually distracting from what's really important.
What have your discussions with these companies and chambers focused on especially?
They're focused on actually growth. You know, how can we move back into our export markets? At the moment, on the short term, it's how can we keep it up? How can we keep export up? Because that brings in the money. But then on the medium term, it's how can we grow? How can we discover new clients? How can we win over new clients? What can we do with German clients? And we have a lot of brands in Germany that are interested. Whether it's agricultural products, whether it's garment, whether it's other products, people are interested. And I mean, tourism. You know, tourism is really something that people in Germany are very interested in. And they're interested in responsible tourism. Tourism that respects the beautiful nature that you have, but also respects the working life of those that are servicing tourists.
From the current crisis to some normalcy, and then to a land of opportunities. I think that's a great way to look at Sri Lanka. You are very optimistic, but let's talk also about, I did promise that we will draw similarities and some values that we can gain from Europe and especially Germany, because you were a former member of parliament of the German federal government. How do we now look at the transition from the spirit of violence, the frustration that the people are faced with, and lawlessness to where we want to go? Let's draw some values that Germany implemented and how long Germany took to see this transition happen, and the kind of patience that we need to also have.
Well, first of all, in our history, we've had situations where people were shooting at each other in the streets of Berlin, where I live. That's around 100 years ago. And you know, you saw opposing political parties really killing each other. And one of the conclusions we drew from that is that that is not the way we ever want to go back to again. So we had a political transition last year from long-time Chancellor Angela Merkel to our now Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And that was very peaceful. It happened in Parliament. They talked to each other. I mean, they've been members of the same government before. So it was a transition where, you know, no protest, no violence, nothing of the kind was around. And that is something people really appreciate. They very often, they have, you know, they think, well, politicians should work more, they not do that, they don't do that. So, you know, it's not that they all think positively about politicians, but they really cherish this way of peacefully negotiating things and making transitions possible when it's necessary. When is a time of crisis, when is a government change, that these things move in a good direction. But it means you need stable institutions. Police needs to work and be reliable. The courts need to work and be reliable, whatever the government is. And media, you need free media that really will report from different angles. The journalists are not threatened. And also, at the end of the day, members of parliament are not threatened. I've never felt threatened in my time as a member of parliament. And I've been exposed here or there. People didn't like what I said, but it was never a personal threat. So these are things that are deeply ingrained in our political and societal fabric because we've seen the other side. And the other side actually at the end led to a war where millions and millions died. So it's really deeply ingrained that we do not want this ever to happen again in our country.
On that note, we'll take a short break here at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24. We are in conversation with Markus Löning, the former Human Rights Commissioner and Member of Parliament of the German federal government, joining us tonight on Ada Derana 24. Towards stability from crisis, towards prosperity through chaos. That is what we're talking about, given Sri Lanka's current context. I'm in conversation with the former Human Rights Commissioner and former Member of Parliament of the German government, Markus Löning. You were an advertising man when you started off right after university, was it?
That's right.
Yeah. How has the journey been from creativity to politics? We thought this only happens in Sri Lanka.
Well, it all started, my children were born, so I needed to make some money. So I thought, okay, let's have a business in advertising. So that's what I did. And then after a while I said, well, I want to move on. And I had the chance to be a candidate for the federal parliament and actually won the seat, which was a great experience.
So from 2002 to 2004, you resigned from your advertising work, 15 years since you founded it. And again, 2002, you're elected to the German government, or the parliament.
To German parliament.
Parliament
right, yeah.
in Berlin. And you continue for 2 terms, you serve for 2 complete terms. And then in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, as per my notes here, you become the Human Rights Commission. Tell us about this transition from advertising man to Human Rights Commissioner, and now talking about human rights law and compliance to businesses and corporates across the globe.
Well, actually, I've always been interested in politics and public debate at school, and then all through my whole life. But then obviously when the children were small, the pressure to make money was high. And when I had the chance to be part of the public debate and to become a member of parliament, I seized the opportunity. And it was looking at the world from a completely different perspective, but it was great to bring that experience of being an owner of a small enterprise into parliament and talk to some of the people there that don't have that experience. What is it like to have a small business? What is it like to have a family with children? Then most of what I did was actually foreign policy. So I was traveling a lot. I was traveling a lot in Asia, mainly actually.
This was with your foreign minister?
That was when I was a member of parliament. So I was still traveling to Central Asia, to South Asia, to East Asia. And I saw a lot of different situations there. And that was another part of my, let's say, way where I could understand more about the world and see that the world has many, many different centers. Europe is not the center of the world. Europe is one part of the world, and there's many, many other parts of the world. And everywhere you go, people feel, this is the center of the world because I'm here. And this is changing perspectives, and it gives you a different feeling about, how to talk about others, how to relate to others. And it's interesting to see that there are things that we all have in common. We want to be protected in our rights. Nobody wants to be robbed, stolen by state authorities, or nobody wants, everyone wants that their children have education, that they have a perspective, that they can build their life. And so there's a lot that actually humans across the world have in common. And at the core, that's human rights.
You spoke about a transition. You spoke about a transition towards stability and good values. The German people and the people of Europe also have seen a difficult time. But we're talking about a political system. How do we go towards the best solution and the most suitable political solution for Sri Lanka? We've seen as many amendments as possible to our constitution, and yet we haven't had a solution to solve basic questions that the entire nation has. We've seen a war, a civil conflict that lasted 3 decades, and then this crisis today. So how do you look at solving this crisis through a constitutional solution that best suits Sri Lanka?
You need the right laws in place, you need the right constitution in place, but then you also need the spirit and the responsibility of people that protect that. And it's not just politicians, it's judges, it's the judiciary, and it's normal citizens. Everyone needs to pay respect to the constitution. That's the basis of how we live together. And we should also be aware that there's no such thing as a perfect constitution. Things will change, and then you will think, we should amend this, or we should change that, because society evolves. situations change. So there's no such thing as a perfect solution and that's it, and we need to no need to worry anymore. It's a constant, engagement. It's a constant thinking process. It's a constant debating process. I mean, if you look at the UK, they have made this, I find, very stupid decision to leave the European Union
with Brexit.
But they made it, and now they need to deal with it. And they're still our neighbors. Now they kicked out their prime minister. Things happen. Politicians or people make wrong decisions, and then you need to catch up and try to, make it better again. So it takes people to engage for society, for the neighborhood, for the family, but also for the whole political system. Otherwise, the best constitution will not protect you. Look at the fight we have in the US, where the former president was not respecting the constitution. And look at the fight that they are having to try and protect their institutions and their constitution. So it's not a specific thing to any one country. It's a fight that we all have in our countries in different ways with different perspectives. And if we can make it, you can make it.
But to bring the country back to respecting law, order, governance, and a legal system, how do we approach that?
Citizens must tell their members of parliament to do that. So that's the first step. I mean, they've elected these people, and they say, I want you to make sure that law and order are respected. So they should tell their representatives. Then they should also act accordingly as citizens. You're in a family, you have friends, you're working you have a workplace. Make sure that people respect each other, that people respect the law. I mean, nobody's a saint, but make sure that respect for the law is something that's positive. Talk about it in a positive way. Talk about it in a way that you say, let's put authority back to those that we have elected to govern us. Let's put authority back to the judicial system. It's something that people need to express positively. Put pressure.
Put pressure, but how far can you go when you put pressure? We're talking about democratic institutions, we're talking about institutions within a legal framework that also where people have the right to voice their disappointment, where their issues are not addressed, where basic human necessities are not granted by a government to the people of the country. And then again, on the other side of this equation, there is people who turn violent and who violate these very norms of human rights and democracy, and maybe being a threat to an average citizen. So how do we balance this through a legal system, through the judiciary, or by instilling law and order in such a way where these institutions are protected, and more importantly, the rights and the basic necessities of the people are granted?
This will never work. Constitutions will not work if those that are in power are not behaving responsibly. And protecting their citizens, their people, is the number one on their to-do list. And that's the livelihoods of people, it's the income of people, it's the way that people live, it's the safety of people. That's the number one that anyone in charge, any government needs to grant to their citizens. That's the reason why they're there. To create an environment where people can feel protected, can feel safe. Money is there to live with their family, to make sure that everything's there that's needed. And if governments don't do that, people will kick them out. And we've seen that throughout history. I mean, it's the 14th of July today, the day of the French Revolution, when exactly that happened in 1789. People said, you're the king, you're supposed to make sure we have a good life, you're gone. And they kicked him out. So revolutions have always happened. The thing is, move to a better place afterwards, and that sometimes is difficult. It takes responsibility of those that have power to change things. So no system will work if only the citizens accept it, but those that are elected into power don't accept it. These people also need to respect the rule of law.
We've seen, that takes us to the question of corruption. We've seen large cases of corruption and alleged violation of laws and corruption cases in Europe, in Germany, in the United States too. How would you advise, coming from that part of the world, that Sri Lanka, we have many allegations of corruption by the very own leaders of our country, but how do you think we should approach this situation in order to either bring back or reclaim funds that belong to the people, or maybe look at a more lasting solution where corruption and this kind of negligence and appropriation of funds of the state are not allowed?
Well, I guess they're not allowed under Sri Lankan law. The thing is, how do you enforce it? And not stealing from the people, I mean, that's very obviously also very high on the agenda. It should be very high on the agenda of any politician. So the cases we had was, before the last elections, a couple of people, members of parliament, there was allegations that they had taken commissions while during the corona crisis. And the things that happened were, first of all, parliament lifted their immunity so that the prosecutors could investigate the cases. The second thing that happened, one of them said, I'll step down from my mandate. The third thing that happened was that the party said, well, we're not going to put you on a list anymore, even though we don't know, there hasn't been a court case yet, but you know, just the allegation that you've been corrupt is not good for our party, so you're not going to be a candidate anymore. And then there was a court case. And at the end of the day, even two of them were acquitted. The judge said, no, it was okay, under the law it was okay. But still what happened before is that, you know, there was a strong judgment that even the allegation of corruption is something that will cost you your job.
And you allow the legal system to proceed with these hearings and to investigate.
It's the legal system, but it's also free media. It's journalists that are investigating the cases, that bring them to the public. And I say, okay, we've got some allegations here. We don't say they did it, but this and this is what we found out. So it's the judicial system has to take care of it, but also media need to be there to report on it.
I'd like to, before we run out of time, talk a little about investment policy, because that's what you're looking at right now. Sri Lanka's image globally is threatened, but at the same time, there is much promise for us going forward. Investment policy, ease of doing business, and creating that framework to allow Sri Lanka to reclaim those lost accounts, if I may say. You've traveled extensively to Asia, the Asia Pacific region, and we've seen Bangladesh and Vietnam surpassing Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka was attracting all these private sector investments for years and decades to come. But something went wrong here, and our environment was not as inviting as it should have been. But how do we rectify this, especially because you have studied the situation in Sri Lanka?
First of all, think good about yourself and talk to others and tell others how great you actually are. So that's really important, to reflect on the role and the opportunities your country has, especially in the region, because I think there are many. Secondly, you need to go through the hardship now with what's going to happen. You need to seriously talk to IMF, because that's an important step to restore trust of investors. And you need political stability. At the end of the day, tourists are coming back when they feel, I can be here and it's peaceful. And investors are coming back when they say, okay, there's a government in place that will have a sound economic policy that will protect investment and make sure that the country can thrive.
But would there be a time soon for Sri Lanka to attract these large-scale investments and not deter them from bringing business to Sri Lanka, especially as we look to solve this foreign currency dollar crisis, as we say, to support Sri Lanka come out of this, the chaos?
Well, I think start now. We don't wait for someone else doing something. The next government will need to take care of the dollar crisis, of the debt crisis. It will need to be very serious with IMF, move forward on that. But business also, they also have a responsibility, and they should go out and find new clients, say, okay, government is taking care of that. It will be a few months, but then we're back on track. So together, that is something that's going to bring that forward. Don't wait for someone to do that for you. You need to take care of that, and then you'll move forward.
What would Europe do different in a scenario as this?
First of all, we have a European Union, which means we do support each other. We're very close to each other in Europe. We had wars for centuries, and at some point after the Second World War, we said, well, let's try things together. So that's what we're doing now, which means that if countries are in crisis, we do support each other. We have created the euro, which is a currency for different countries, and if one country has a problem, other countries will support it. So we're not alone. That
and
really makes a difference.
And Germany as an independent nation?
Germany as an independent nation will always make sure that workers can stay in, and there will be state subsidies, for example, when companies go back as a first step. But then also there will be support for export, for example. We have institutions in place. We have a government that knows, and any government of any party actually knows that this is where we're making our money. We need to sell our products to other countries across the world, so there will always be support there.
How do we exploit the opportunities to export more to Germany and enhance the market space for Sri Lankan and products from Ceylon in the German market?
Once that a government is in place that people will trust, a government that is serious about the problems, German investors will start coming back and they will say, okay, this is serious. And then they will need to find mechanisms in place that show also in reality things are moving forward. There will be political support from European governments because they have an interest in keeping Sri Lanka as a stable partner in the region, as a democracy, as a country we're sharing a lot of values with. So there is an interest, and I'm sure there's going to be political support and economic support also for Sri Lanka. But the effort needs to be made. The effort needs to be made to have a sound economic policies, takes away red tape where it's not needed, that will make sure that investments are possible, are safe, that the currency crisis is resolved, and that gives support to Sri Lankan companies that have the products and the capabilities to export.
Is there room for improvement in terms of moving towards best practices and standards required by the European market when we especially talk about Sri Lankan exports there?
One of the advantages Sri Lanka has that Europe is talking a lot about sustainability, and sustainability means green, so respecting the climate and the environment, but it also means social, treating people well that actually are working on the products. And Sri Lanka is in a fairly good place there. There's always room for improvement. There's work possible on that. But that's a competitive advantage. If you come to the European market and say, we know that you're interested in sustainability standards. We know that you have laws in place. And we're there, we can meet these standards. That will give you a competitive edge.
And what areas do you think we still should improve, especially when we talk about products and services to Germany? You've spoken to these chambers, export industries and businesses that may be looking at expanding their export market. In terms of products and services, what's the preference there?
You have some great products, but some of these products have been on the market for many, many years. And so the question is, what kind of products do we want to sell 10 years or 15 years from now? So there must be efforts in research and development, which will take place in companies, obviously, but there should also be universities, education, research labs, trying to find out what's going to be the thing, the next big thing, and what can be our place in that. So what's the research we need? And some of that will have to be state-sponsored. Some will take place in commercial activities. But I think it's a question of feeling responsible for the development of the country, giving young people perspectives. They're all digital. So what's the next new big digital product that Sri Lanka can bring to the market? So these kind of thoughts need to be there, and it's government's responsibility to bring people together, be they think tank, academics, people from the business world, government people, bring them together and make sure something new happens there.
From crisis to stability, we said, towards prosperity through this chaos that we're seeing. What's the outlook for Sri Lanka from an outsider's perspective?
As I was saying in the beginning, I'm an optimist. Coming from the outside, what I see a lot of opportunities for your country. You have very well-educated workforce. You have a lot of intelligent, well-educated people that are there, that can take more responsibility, that can create something new. You have great businesses that work on a global level, that are meeting world standards. Others can learn from that. You have great opportunity regarding the tourism sector. And I think you have a great opportunity of developing something new. At the moment, I hear younger people have a tendency to have a look outside. Get them back. Show them that, you know, their best place to be is your country, and taking responsibility for that.
Thank you, Markus, for your time here at our studios, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to enjoy your stay in our beautiful island, and you'll be able to return back to our country.
I certainly will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've been talking to Markus Löning, the former Human Rights Commissioner of Germany, previously a Member of Parliament of the German federal government, and earlier an advertising agency owner, and currently advertising governments and businesses on exports and compliance with human rights standards that Europe requires. Thank you very much for tuning in to at Hydepark on Ada Derana 24. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion. To stay with us. Good night.